And thank you for joining us tonight for our Conversations with CAGT. I'm Dr. Colleen Ehrlich, and it is my honor to be the president of CAGT. And I am here tonight to introduce Dr. Susan Assouline, who is the professor of school psychology and director of the Belin-Blank Center. She holds the Myron and Jacqueline N Endowed Chair in Gifted Education. Dr. Assouline has two primary lines of research, twice-exceptionality and academic acceleration, which she will be speaking about here tonight. She, along with others, was the lead developer of the Iowa Acceleration Scale, a tool designed to guide educators and parents through decisions about grade skipping students. And most recently has developed the Integrated Acceleration System, an online interactive tool for making whole grade acceleration decisions. And I know we're going to be hearing about both of those tools tonight, which is going to be very exciting. In 2015, she co-edited A Nation Empowered, Evidence Trumps the Excuses Holding Back America's Brightest Students, which was the follow-up publication to the 2004 Templeton report, A Nation Deceived, How Students Hold Back America's Brightest Students. She received the National Association for Gifted Children 2016 Distinguished Scholar Award, the 2018 University of Iowa Award for Faculty Excellence, the 2019 University of Iowa Leadership in Research Award, and in 2019 was inducted into the 2E Hall of Fame. So we are so excited to have Dr. Assouline talking tonight on the why, who, and how of academic acceleration. And with that, I will pass it over to you. We're excited to hear your talk.
Well, thanks very much. Give me a second here, and I'm going to start to share screen. Cross your fingers, everybody. Oops. And so I assume it's sharing. All right, somebody will tell me if it's not. Well, hello, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of your conversation tonight. I am looking forward to talking with you about one of my favorite topics, academic acceleration. And I know that we'll have some opportunity to also have some questions and answers. And I'm not able to see the chat, but I really hope that you'll be putting things into the chat and we'll talk about them as we go along. I guess it wouldn't be a presentation without some type of PowerPoint, right? So I have one of these and we'll go ahead and go through this and then I'll try to make it available afterwards. So we are going to talk about academic acceleration here and just want to, all right, so there's kind of a lot to unpack in terms of that title. I talk specifically about the why, the who, and the how of academic acceleration, but I can't really talk about those three things without also addressing what and when. So let's start basically with what is acceleration. And we all probably have an idea about what acceleration is, but there actually is an official definition. And that definition is that acceleration is progression. So it represents moving through an educational program in a shorter time or at a younger age than is typical. So it's pretty simple and pretty short, but it actually really has served us well as a field for decades, more than 70 decades, and it still seems to be quite applicable. There are two main categories of acceleration. So we break them up according to grade-based acceleration and content-based acceleration. And I'm going to spend more time today talking about grade-based acceleration because it can be sometimes a little bit more complicated and more complex when you think about that. That being said, content-based acceleration is also another form of acceleration, and there are some basic differences between the two. For example, in grade-based acceleration, kind of going back to that definition, shorter time or at a younger age, then they don't really remain with their same aged peers. Whereas in content-based acceleration, they would stay with their same age peers for most of the day. It is typically a shorter time in the K-12 school setting unless they enter kindergarten early. And if they enter kindergarten early and they don't accelerate anymore, then they would be in the K-12 school setting the typical amount of time. But traditionally, when we think of grade skipping, we think that they're spending less time in the K-12 setting. In content-based acceleration, it just means that they would receive advanced curriculum in one or more subjects before the expected grade level. Social emotional is a major consideration when we're talking about acceleration. It's probably one of the main reasons that we hear people say that they are concerned about academic acceleration. And certainly in the area of grade-based acceleration, it does make sense that we are taking social emotional aspects into consideration. I'll talk just a little bit more about that a little later on. They are also something that could be considered with content-based acceleration, but not nearly as, they're not nearly as salient when it comes to making a decision about content acceleration. And then just some examples of grade-based acceleration would be, as I mentioned earlier, early entrance to kindergarten, skipping a grade like skipping 4th grade, or early entrance to college. And that would be another example where they're spending a shorter amount of time in the K-12 setting. Content-based acceleration is something that happens quite often in schools, and sometimes people aren't even aware that that's what's happening. For example, advanced placement is an example of content-based acceleration. And when students are taking AP Calculus, for example, that is a college level course that they're taking in high school, so they're getting advanced curriculum. And so that's just one example of content-based acceleration. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that these forms of acceleration are not mutually exclusive. You can have one or more of the forms happening throughout a student's academic career, and it's not that uncommon. I think we all can connect to a student who motivated us to think about academic acceleration. If you've heard me present before on acceleration, then you have probably seen this letter. And actually, there's a kind of a version of it in the manual for the Iowa Acceleration Scale. But this is the original letter. You know, obviously, it's been transferred to the slide. But this letter was written by a child who gave it to her mother, who was taking a class from me in the evenings. Her mother drove like 90 miles. This was pre-Zoom, pre-internet type of thing. And so her mother drove 90 miles after working all day long teaching in a school. She came to class. It was an assessment class, assessment for gifted education class. And she had been talking about acceleration with her child, and I'd been talking about it with the class. And her child just spontaneously wrote this letter to her principal and the teacher, and the mother brought it in. And this letter just gets me every time I look at it. So let's take a minute to talk about it. Dear Mrs. Stephen and Mr. Jurgensen, I find that the work I'm being given is very discouraging because it's much too easy. Most of it I know, so I do the work, catch on, and I have to wait for others to catch on. The grade I'd like to go to would be college. But since I can't, could I have something more challenging? Say, for instance, I could go to any grade I want as long as it's in Carpenter or Shannon. I'd like to try 5th grade. I doubt it, but it would be nice to go there and see what it's like. I don't care if I leave Shannon because I really don't have anything really important or true friends that I'd miss. And what you hear in this letter, what you see in this letter is this child's plea for challenge, an expression of discouragement, and a recognition of the role of friendships in schools. So when I think about children like Jody, and this was a long time ago, she's now in her 40s. She actually was accelerated. It had a happy ending, and she ended up being further accelerated in college. And she actually ended up getting her doctorate in nursing and is a faculty member in the School of Nursing. But when I think about students like Jody and other students, and I think about their development, I'm reminded of a way of thinking about student development that I have found to be really helpful. And you may have already been exposed to this in your own coursework, either your professional development or possibly in some graduate coursework. But Yuri Bronfenbrenner developed a bioecological system of child development. And I think that this really captures some of the things that we need to talk about when we're talking about academic acceleration. So you don't have to worry about these names here, but just keep in mind, so you've got the child who's at the core of things. And, if you think about that child when they're first born, they don't have a lot of other things that are impacting them in terms of the environment. But then, slowly but surely, they have kind of a microsystem of environmental impacts. And then that would eventually, as they get a little older, include the school, et cetera, and, possibly church and neighborhood and community. And so the mesosystem represents all of the connections among those microsystems. The exosystem refers to indirect impact on the child, like the child's environment. And that is really kind of, think about the school, think about the principal, for example. The child may not have direct connections with that principal, but that principal has an indirect impact on the child's environment, on whether or not the school is amenable to academic acceleration. And then we have the macro system, which is kind of the societal and the cultural values and how that impacts the child. So when Jody was young and interested in being advanced, she didn't quite know how to express what she needed, but she was expressing her discouragement. The society wasn't really looking at academic acceleration as an option, but eventually that did become an option. And there is more, people in general now are more amenable to academic acceleration. But, we still have a long ways to go. And having you participate in this conversation tonight, I hope will help to extend this. And then we have the chronosystem, which represents changes over time. And that happens, obviously, quite often in terms of, how things evolve and change. You have things happening, with your government, with state governments, with federal governments, just kind of the zeitgeist, the way things are happening. So I think of this because when a child is born and a child grows and develops, one of the things that they're striving for is they're striving to feel as though they are competent. And what Jody was expressing in her letter was this sense of discouragement, of searching for a way so that she could feel more competent. And if I could see you and we were in a different situation, I would ask you to just take a second to think about that child. Maybe it's your own child, maybe it's a child who you've had in class, who has impacted you and for whom you might be thinking that academic acceleration is something that may need to be considered. Now, Jody talked about friends. And a lot of people, as I mentioned in one of the early slides, that social emotional considerations are something that many people would state as a reason to not accelerate students. But the research has really made it clear that students are more interested in being placed with academic peers with similar interests and similar intellectual level than they are with being placed with sane age mates. We have a lot of research on social development and academic acceleration. And in general, it's not just neutral, it's positive. And a really important presentation, a really important publication by Bernstein, Lubinsky, and Bembo, and they have been doing research in the area of academic acceleration for nearly 50 years, has demonstrated that the social emotional concerns that people talk about are basically just fruitless. We don't need to worry about that. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't take them into consideration, and there are certainly some things that need to be considered when it comes to the transition from the current grade into the accelerated grade. So that is not what I'm saying, but I am saying that we don't need to just categorically dismiss this as an option because we think that there will be issues. And I'll talk about that towards the end when I share with you another letter. All right, so kind of what is it? Now, who and when should acceleration be considered? About, oh gosh, I can't believe that it's been nearly 7 years since we published A Nation Empowered. But shortly after we published A Nation Empowered, we had a symposium about academic acceleration, and our colleague, Joyce Van Tassel-Baska, was a keynote speaker at that symposium. And one of the things that Joyce said just was so striking in terms of the statement that she made. And it's really different, I think, from the way we oftentimes think about acceleration. Many times we think that acceleration is like, well, let's just try everything else. And then if that doesn't work, then we will consider acceleration. But Joyce's perspective, and I agree with this, is that acceleration should be the first intervention that we consider for bright, highly capable students. And all other interventions should follow after acceleration has first been considered. And it also doesn't mean that acceleration precludes some of these interventions, such as enrichment or differentiation. And to me, that is such a profound statement. And it's a really profound way of thinking about this intervention that is different from the way we oftentimes have thought about it. So I would challenge you to think about that as well. Okay, who needs to be accelerated? Well, I've been hinting at that. If you're looking at my screen, you might say, why does she have something in green and why does she have something in blue? And it's just to show you that I can mess a little bit with the PowerPoint. But anyway, who needs to be accelerated? Well, students who are demonstrating a readiness to learn. And I'm going to talk about these three things next. Students who are demonstrating a readiness to perform excellently in the next grade. You do need to look at all aspects of the student's development. That's going to get into kind of the how. And that does, of course, include a discussion about if a student skips a grade and any social emotional issues, if they are more of a concern. Those are all things that connect to the how part of this presentation. So, I mentioned achievement, ability, and aptitude testing, and I want to talk about that just very briefly, but perhaps you'll have some questions a little later on, and I'm happy to expand upon that. So there are three main things that need to be taken into consideration when you're thinking about readiness to perform at the next grade level. And first of all, you want to give students an achievement test, and you want to give them an achievement test that can give you a lot of information about their current level of performance. And when I think of achievement, I also think of it as kind of from a temporal perspective. It's talking about what students have already learned. So that's past tense. And that is important because you want to make sure that they've mastered. Now, that doesn't mean it has to be 100%, but you want to make sure that they've mastered the content at the current grade level. Now, the thing that you don't know about that mastery at the current grade level is you don't know when they learned it or how they learned it. And most importantly, you don't know what they're ready to learn next. And that's where the notion of aptitude comes in. And you can't take any shortcuts in terms of getting this information about students' academic readiness. You have to be able to predict that they're going to continue to perform excellently in the next grade, not just mediocre. Because if they're high achieving, but they don't have the aptitude to have excellent performance in the next grade, then you're setting them up for unnecessary frustration. But if they also can demonstrate that they're ready to perform well in the next grade, then you're setting them up for an opportunity to have their knowledge, their skills, their talents developed. Now, achievement is exposure to content, what they have learned. Aptitude is a little less exposure to content, but content nonetheless, just are they going to be ready to learn the next level of content? An ability test is sort of more like the general cognitive power. You may in your schools use the cognitive abilities test. It's an absolutely fantastic group administered test. Or you may actually have students in your schools who have taken individual ability tests. And those are really, just the gold standard, if you will. What a cognitive ability test tells you is that cognitive power of the student's readiness to learn the curriculum at a faster pace. And so the word pace is really important. And there are ways that we can link the student's IQ and the standard deviations above average to help us understand that students' readiness to learn at a faster pace. And so that information is really critical when it comes to thinking about kind of the who and the how of academic acceleration. Now, I just want to mention very briefly academic acceleration in twice exceptional students. Twice exceptionality is quite a paradox because a student who is academically gifted and talented in one or more areas also has a learning, a social, emotional, or a developmental disability, such as autism spectrum disorder. At the Belin-Blank Center, we've focused on three main types of twice exceptionality: autism, specific learning disability, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And acceleration is often offered as an intervention, more often to twice exceptional students who have autism compared to students, for example, with a specific learning disability. If we have time, I'm happy to answer more questions about that, but you'll also have access to my email if you have other questions. Now, where do you find the research about acceleration? Well, you can go to the Acceleration Institute at this website here, and you can get just a wealth of information about academic acceleration. I'm going to talk specifically about the integrated acceleration system in just a few moments. But I would encourage you to check that out because you can also get access to publications, et cetera. So some of the decision-making tools that are available to you on the Acceleration Institute website were developed by the Belin-Blank Center. So you can get some information on that website about above-level testing, and you may be quite familiar with the Center for Bright Kids in Colorado, housed in Denver, and they do they're a university-based talent search. But you can also get information about above-level testing in school using an online instrument that we developed, and that's the iExcel. It's something that we developed for 4th through 6th graders. And above-level testing is really helpful when it comes to making decisions about content acceleration. iExcel, for example, tests students above grade level. We use an 8th grade test for 4th through 6th graders, and it gives you information about reading, math, English, and science. The integrated acceleration system, which I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about, is an online tool to support an objective decision-making process. And the beauty of this online tool is that it produces a detailed report with recommendations concerning the match between moving a student ahead of grade and that student. So how does it do that? Well, it does that because, as I said, it's an online tool, and the algorithm that my colleagues and I have developed, in particular, my colleagues who are quite talented in the area of coding, actually puts all of the data together and then produces a report. And I will encourage you to check out more information about the integrated acceleration system. And if you want to email me, I do have my email address at the end, and learn more about it or make a request for an access code, I'm happy to provide that to you. So the integrated acceleration, as I said, it's online, it's interactive. It gives you access to Belin-Blank Center experts, especially in the area of twice-exceptionality. It includes student interview questions, and then it produces a multi-page individualized report. And that report is produced at the conclusion of a team meeting, and it's emailed to all of the team members. There's a survey that's filled out as part of the integrated acceleration system, and that survey includes items that address the student's performance and attitude in school, friendship and motivation, communication between parent and school, and then that all-important area known as achievement, ability, and aptitude testing. These are all things that need to be taken into consideration when you're thinking about, how do I go about making the decision about academic acceleration for a student? And what we've done over many years is we've put all of this information online, and we've made it interactive for people. You're required to make this decision as part of a team using the integrated acceleration system. And even some of you who may be more familiar with the paper and pencil product that was also produced by my colleagues and myself at the Belin-Blank Center, the Iowa Acceleration Scale, they're not the same thing, but they're related. Requires that a team meets. And that team is really important because it should not just be a decision made by one person. It's not just the parent who goes in and says, I want my child to be accelerated. It has to be a consideration of many different facts. One of the most, in addition to the parent and the current teacher, the future classroom teacher is really important to include as part of that team conversation. And then in the end, you get a report that summarizes the discussion and summarizes all of the information that's been put in as part of the integrated acceleration system. And that report tells you whether or not it's a good match. One of the things that's really important to keep in mind is that the process of gathering the appropriate information and making an informed decision, empowering the team members, and trusting the participants who provide that information is extremely powerful. You've got all of the stakeholders who were involved in this very important, very visible decision. And you just cannot underestimate the power of that process and the importance of not taking any shortcuts when you're going through that process. So the primary components to think about when you're considering how to do this would be to review the information, to discuss important questions, to understand what types of questions or hesitation the student may have and address those, to consider social emotional aspects, and to really think about, as a group, how do we come to consensus on what we understand about this student? And last but not least, as part of the components of making a decision, is to develop a transition plan for moving into the next grade. Now, an important question to take into consideration is, What happens if we don't accelerate a student who is ready for acceleration? Well, this is really a critical issue to investigate and to discuss, because the research tells us that acceleration is very successful for carefully selected students. And if you choose to do nothing, you've still made a decision. And the consequences of inaction are that the student may become disengaged in the talent development and the growth process, which you saw in that letter by Jody. You know, if there was no action, she was really sharing in her own way how she was really getting to the point of being disengaged. Now, sometimes when acceleration is being considered, it may be that it's something that will need to happen, but right now it might not be the right time. So it could still be considered for a future option. All right, so here's Jody's letter. Now, what I have here is, this is straight from the child. This is some questions that a colleague of mine asked a student who had been accelerated into 4th grade. And just my colleague asked a student to answer these questions in terms of the acceleration. And here's what the student had to say. So, and this happened smoothly. They went through the integrated acceleration system. Jody didn't have that benefit, but her mother knew how to advocate for her. So here's what this student said from the experience last year. My experience in 4th grade so far has actually been amazing because I'm finding the work to be not that hard. Well, I guess that's one way of saying that she's not frustrated. The best part about being in 4th grade is that I love my teacher and I'm making a lot of friends really easily. I sat in, I lurked kind of, I was in the Zoom room when they were having this conversation, and I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to have the possible future teacher there, because that future teacher can make or break whether or not the transition goes smoothly. So as you can see, this child is not frustrated. In fact, she says 4th grade isn't too challenging because most of the stuff that is new for me is new for other kids too. So good approach. My advice, I love this from a 4th grader, is that even if you don't want to skip a grade, it is better to have work that is hard than to have work that is too easy. And that just makes me smile, because I think of researchers sitting in colleges of education all across the world, across the country and around the world. And this is something that we've worked really hard to demonstrate, that you cannot develop academically if your work is too easy. And here she just says it beautifully. And then she says, if I didn't skip a grade, I definitely would have regretted it because the work would be too easy. So I think when you hear what the students have to say, you can really see the benefits of this. So again, I would encourage you to go to the accelerationinstitute.org website. You can get a lot of information there about the integrated acceleration system, about policy. And of course, Colorado has been really just at the forefront in terms of setting policy about academic acceleration. You can download for free both volumes of A Nation Empowered, and you can get information about the report that is also produced from the above level testing that the Belin-Blank Center does. Connect with us. We are reachable by Twitter at Belin-Blank. We have a Facebook page, and I'm sure when this is done and we get, we'll also connect this to our Facebook page. We have a pretty robust blog that several people contribute to from the Belin-Blank Center. And we have a newsletter that comes out every other month, and that also has a lot of information. We love to have people who are connected to us. So these are ways that you can connect with us. And I would challenge you to think about, well, okay, what are you going to do next? I would encourage you to visit the Acceleration Institute website to review A Nation Empowered. It's a 2-volume publication. Volume 1 is very colorful, and it has a lot of really good stories. We put faces behind the research. Volume 2 is the research. I would encourage you to share this presentation with a colleague or other stakeholders. Contact us if you've got any questions or you want more information about the integrated acceleration system. And I would really encourage you to consider a research opportunity, and of course, all of the above. Now, here's that information about the research opportunity. The National Center for Research on Gifted Education, which is at the University of Connecticut, received a Javits grant. And they, as I think everybody probably knows, that since they've had all of the Javits grants since 1988, they've done amazing work. And we are really thrilled that they have included acceleration as part of this current Javits project. And they have a grant that part of the grant, one of the studies is focused on academic acceleration. And if you are interested in expanding your use of subject-specific and whole grade acceleration in your school, you can go to this website here or email me, and you can sign up and you'll get professional learning about acceleration, how it can be used. You'll learn about a universal screening process, and you'll get resources and professional learning to help you implement subject acceleration and whole grade acceleration. I know there's also a tiny stipend, and you need to do it soon because the deadline for expressing interest is February 15th. You've heard me talk about some of the things that happen at the Belin-Blank Center. I don't do anything in a vacuum either. I've got a wonderful little microsystem and mesosystem in terms of colleagues. And here's a fairly recent photo. It was taken pre-pandemic of my many colleagues. We're a team and we all work together. So I was really happy to present to you tonight, but I do want to emphasize that I have many colleagues at the center and we do all kinds of things that I hope you will learn more about. And I'm going to stop sharing because I hope that there will be some questions.
Yes, thank you so much. First for your work as well as for sharing it here with us tonight. So thank you so much. We do actually have quite a few questions. And so I'm just going to start with them. So our first question was, I've had administrators express concern about the social emotional development of children who are accelerated from elementary to middle and middle to high school. Can you please suggest some research studies, which I think you already have, but I'm still going to read the question. Can you please suggest some research studies or readings I can share to help dispel these myths?
Well, yes, obviously, Nation Empowered, there's a really powerful chapter by Karen Rogers in there where she presents effect sizes. And effect sizes really talk about the impact that the intervention has on a student. And academically, the intervention has just really robust, a really robust positive impact. But many people just, I think they sort of put themselves in the place of the child and they think, oh, this just can't be good for them socially, emotionally. And actually, the research demonstrates that from a social emotional perspective, as well as a psychological perspective, that it really does make a difference. Now, that's in volume 2 of A Nation Empowered, but volume 1 tells the stories behind that. And I think it's really powerful to hear the stories. In A Nation Empowered, there's just an incredibly powerful story. I think it's story number 2 about a boy who was academically accelerated, but what happened prior to that and how miserable he was. And that's what we keep hearing. I mean, you saw that in the letter from Jody. And so it is a myth, and it is important to dispel that on the one hand. On the other hand, it is important to pay attention to what the student has to say about his or her development. Now, I wouldn't hold a student back if there are social emotional concerns. I wouldn't necessarily hold a student back because you're not going to address those concerns by holding them back. I would address the concerns. And there are many resources that we have available. I mean, mental health issues are huge. They're rampant. They've become so much more challenging just in the past couple of years. And we do have resources to help us address those. So it's not an option, in my humble opinion, to hold a student back from academic advancement because there may be some issues. And it surely shouldn't be an option if we don't even know more about that.
Yeah, thank you. And I think you hit on an important point, right? Because the person who asked that question really was gauging that towards an administrator. And I think so many administrators now do understand effect sizes because of John Hattie's work and visible learning and how that's become so mainstream. And so I think connecting it to the effect sizes that Karen Rogers has done around acceleration is a really good entry point for administrators to understand. And then I also think that you touched on a really important point, both in the answer to that question as well as in your presentation, of have the administrator sit on the team and actually talk to the student and like get personally involved and invested in them, especially in some of our really large schools just across the nation. You know, you think about some of these comprehensive like middle schools, high schools, elementary, where they just have thousands of kids. And having them become personally invested is always absolutely a very good thing. Okay, so the next question. I'd like to hear any thoughts / words of wisdom on when to choose acceleration. Any thoughts on acceleration for very young kids?
Well, it's not an easy answer. And I think it's important to keep in mind that there are many things that you need to take into consideration. And so sometimes for very young kids, it is appropriate to wait just a little bit of time or to start out a little slowly, maybe with some content acceleration. Because the thing that we don't know about very young kids is they just haven't been on Earth that long. You know, their microsystems are still pretty small, still pretty close, right? So you just don't have a lot of opportunity to have observed them. Sometimes they don't have the stamina to stay, you know, all day long in school, and eventually physically that catches up. So you may approach that with caution. One thing that we say about early entrance to kindergarten, now this is kind of ironic because the date that most states have for when students can enter kindergarten varies across the country. But we usually say they shouldn't be much more than 3 or 4 months younger than the students in that grade. So it would sort of like imply that if a student had if the entry date was say early September, that the student would have a birth date sometime in the fall, so that they would be 4 years and 8 months or 4 years and 9 months when they started. And truly at that age, as you know, the first year of life, there's so much rapid growth. And even, you know, from 4 to 5, there's just so much rapid growth that happens that it can really make a difference. So it may be something that is going to need to happen, but it may not be the right time. I would say go through the system. The system forces you to think about these issues.
Yeah. And I think it's an interesting point, and it does vary from state to state, right? On when is that cut date for entrance into kindergarten. In Colorado, it's October 1st. So if you have that dreaded October 5th, right? Or that September 27th, where then it really is the parents' decision on like, what do we do here? Do you be the youngest? Do you be the oldest? It is an interesting time in development. Okay, so this is an interesting question. It's written from a CAGT member, and it says, we're a gifted and talented elementary school who has GT teachers that feel that acceleration and compacting should not happen. What can I do to help them realize that sometimes this is appropriate? It's mainly in the subject of math.
So in that, and maybe this is, I'm just making the assumption that they feel that it's not necessarily appropriate because they're in a GT school. And so that they're probably being appropriately challenged, and they might be, but it does sound like there may need to be additional consideration in terms of specific subjects. And math is so easy to get more information. The above level testing in the area of math can just be so helpful, and it can really help you understand why students may need to be exposed to more challenge. from a psychosocial perspective, a social emotional perspective, one of my favorite research studies, which was done many years ago, but Csikszentmihalyi, who recently passed away, but quite a well-known researcher in the area of creativity and flow. He and his colleagues looked at kind of what makes a difference in terms of the development of talent. So why do some talented teenagers drop out from developing their talent, and why do some stay engaged? And what they determined is that you cannot learn something, you can't develop your talent unless you have the chance to be engaged in learning something new. And it's really as simple as that. So we just need to find ways to give them opportunities to learn something new. And I mean, if you're interested in making sure that your students get their talents developed, then it's kind of a no-brainer. I wouldn't put it quite like that, but I would say let's just get more information. I'm a big believer in having information and making decisions based upon information.
And I think it's smart, right? Because there's not many educators out there that if you tap into that core philosophical belief of, do you believe that every single student should learn something new every day? And then how do we make sure, based on like data, that that is happening? So I think that's great. Really fast, we did have a question in the chat about the link wasn't working, obviously, because we're in Zoom sharing onto Facebook Live. So to access that information that was there on that link, where would they go on your website to find that information, just so we can help them find it a little bit?
About the information about the integrated acceleration system?
Well, I'm not really sure, because I just said that the link wasn't working. So it must have been one of the links to, I'm not sure where in your presentation that it came up, because
can I send that separately and we can post that? Can you post that on your Facebook?
Yeah, I'm sure we can figure out a way to do that. So yeah, that'd be great. But I think they can access all of it through your guys' website, right?
Yes, but let me make, yes, I'll work with the people who know a lot more about the technology than I do to make sure that it works. Oh, and I see that we have just put that in the chat. I don't know if that appears in the Facebook.
It doesn't, but I didn't see it in my chat. So we'll have to figure it out. Oh, okay. There it is. Now it's there. Okay. Yep. I can transfer that over into Facebook in just a moment, maybe when you're answering this next question. So this next question is, what checks/adaptations are there for accelerating 2E kids as necessary when so many acceleration decisions are based on tests and performance metrics? For example, it's not unusual for 2E kids to perform at grade level or below on achievement tests, despite a general ability to process concepts above grade level. How do you navigate this issue?
Well, you navigate it one student at a time. That's really important. You just can't make generalizations about that. I know I'm going to sound like a broken record, but actually there just is no shortcut to getting the necessary information. And so take a look at that information and don't just look at, like full scale scores or composite scores. With the twice exceptional student, you really need to look at very specific information to help you better understand that student's ability to learn and to move at a faster pace, et cetera. As I said, in our research, what we have seen is that it is not uncommon for students who have an ASD, an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis, to actually be ready for whole grade acceleration. But students who have a specific learning disability, whole grade acceleration may not be the most appropriate approach. They are still going to need some acceleration, but it may just be in the content area. We have another publication, I didn't even think about this, called Packet of Information for Professionals. And we have some really good case studies in there that talk about the need for challenge, et cetera, but taking a look at the different disability category, ASD or ADHD or specific learning disability. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but basically you just really need more information.
And I think it's kind of what we were talking about too before this, in terms of having those advocates who know gifted and know 2E as a part of that team to really just like look at that data from a strength-based approach as well. And just making sure that all parts of that student are seen throughout the process, which I know is a huge part of your Belin-Blank Center. So last, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to say also keeping in mind that, you know, it's the whole child. You do want to take a look at the whole child, and you're trying to strike that balance between giving them an opportunity to learn something new. And they may have different strategies for learning, but not having them be overly frustrated. So, but also not bored. And so you have a few other things that you need to take into consideration when a student has a disability, and it depends on the disability in terms of their overall psychosocial development too. So it's a very reasonable question to ask.
Absolutely. And this will be our last question of the night. The question came in what are your thoughts on single subject acceleration based on your research? Do you find that kids who test high in one subject but are accelerated in all subjects to the next grade do well across those subjects, or is it better to think about acceleration on a subject by subject basis?
Well, that's a good question. It's there's not you know, one easy answer to that, but I would just say that one of the things that I like about above level testing, for example, and is that especially if you use a test that has kind of a verbal and a quantitative measure, and also about cognitive ability, is that you can actually understand the likelihood that a student's going to continue to be successful in the accelerated grade. If you don't just do subject acceleration, you do whole grade acceleration, but you need to know kind of what their verbal ability is. And I don't want, it's not possible for me to go into this in this level of detail, but in our research, kind of just stepping back in our twice exceptional research, we know that the students who are likely to have autism spectrum diagnosis of ASD have very high verbal ability, but they have really deficits in their ability to process information. Well, that high verbal ability makes it likely that they're going to succeed in school across all areas. But the deficits in their ability to process information can present some challenges. So you may want to start slowly with subject acceleration and then see how that goes. And you may need to do whole grade acceleration. So it's just, if they have the verbal ability, they can tend to do quite well. But if it's just subject like math and the verbal ability is above average, but not excellent, then keep them in the other content areas at the grade level and move them ahead in math and reassess the next year.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And with that, we're going to thank everybody who joined us this evening, and special thanks to Dr. Assouline for joining us here. And we will see you next Tuesday for our next Conversations with CAGT.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for inviting me.